To my dearest friends, I am honored to welcome you back once more, to present you with an insidious tale from the grim darkness of the far future. We are all well aware of the ever-present threats of chaos, where the scions of the ruinous powers will seek to overthrow and desecrate the prosperous worlds of the Imperium, just to sate the eternal appetites of the starving demons and of their dark gods. We have previously learnt of the worlds of Geistos and Toreus, which keeled under the weight of a violent incursion, whilst the oceanic jewel of Eidothea was stolen from within by a nefarious servant misled by a greater demon of Tzeentch. But while these were all imperial worlds, we must acknowledge that none are to be considered as safe, and that the dangers of chaos will always loom even over the Forge worlds of the Adeptus Mechanicus. The technophants of Mars have shed the weaknesses of their flesh, favouring instead the absolute certainty of steel. But they still possess the souls of a human, and any soul, no matter how devoted, may one day be corrupted and consumed by the temptations of the warp. Most Martians, though fascinated by technology, will still hold their own suspicions about new discoveries. Much of the galaxy was once ravaged during the cybernetic rebellions of the so-called Age of Strife. And since the days of the Horus Heresy, the traitorous Dark Mechanicum continues to seed the stars with corrupted artifacts containing the worm-like taint of the immaterial powers. Thus, if an exploratory fleet was to retrieve a hitherto undiscovered relic, then the priests would usually initiate a quarantine before purifying and studying the strange tool. But if the priests, in their arrogant hubris, choose to abstain from such a process, then they may be unwittingly inviting the forces of the ruinous powers to descend and claim their world for the gods. This was notably to be the case for the Forge world of Telchinea, a once loyal fortress of industry now perverted and corrupted by the forces who exist beyond our mortal domain. In recent years, the planet has ceased in its expected output, prompting an imperial investigation, and it is from this team's findings that I now present to you with the following tale. Today, we shall be investigating the tragic history of this world. The story will begin with the beliefs of the pre-imperial societies and of how they clashed with the cultists of Mars, as this will help elucidate as to why, in the 41st millennium, that this world no longer serves mankind. But now, with the pieces set, I do believe that time is of the essence, and that we must now begin. This tale, like with Eidothea, is not one which is to be found within the historical records of the Imperium, but as it so stands today, none are aware of the true story of the dark rebirth of Telchinea Forge. In the farthest reaches of what would one day be crowned as Segmentum Pacificus, orbiting the warm amber star of Clytotechnes, lay a world which would come to be known as Telchinea. To look upon this planet from orbit would reveal a realm which appeared to have been carved by hands most cruel. It was marred by jagged mountain ranges, towering high above the deep valleys, stretching out as though they were wounds unto the earth itself. Yet, buried beneath this desolate landscape was wealth. The subterranean grounds were rich with rare minerals and exotic ores, though to reach them one would need to survive the howling magnetic storms, grinding tectonics, and skin-tearing gales, ever to be roaring through the wilderness. But despite the horrors, during an age long before the Imperium had first been founded, Humanity had already reached out into the distant stars and seized this world for themselves. These intrepid souls were the Telechines, a people who had endured the hardships to forge a curious civilization quite unlike any other. Once confined to the safety found beneath the surface, the huddled families could not deny the fact that through the cracks could they hear the howling storms, and that during the darkness of night did it sound as though it were speaking out, beckoning for them to embrace the true nature of their home. Many ignored this call, and yet, over the passing generations, the Telechines could not reject the constant temptations, prompting a fated shift which would forever define their kind. They started to believe that they could live in harmony with the electromagnetic tempests, inventing technological tools which would protect them from the carnage of nature. The artificers who created the machines admitted that they themselves knew not of how they functioned, but claimed that the schematics were heard through the howling storms, and that all they needed to do was to sit within the tempest and embrace the chaos. Humming to life, the machines projected an invisible field which protected the surrounding area from the great tempests, finally permitting the subterranean Telechines to emerge and live upon the surface, ever to now bear witness to the powers of the storm. Over time, their society became more dedicated towards the worship of the storms, which their new priestly class had claimed as being divine in their very nature. Their bodies bore the marks of generations of self-modification. Silvered skin repelling the charged particles of their atmosphere, ocular implants to perceive the electromagnetic spectrum, and neural augmentations, which permitted them to connect and commune with the strange machines forged by their ancestors. To the Telechines, technology was not merely a means of survival, but the sacred bridge between their mortal existence and the divine. They revered the electromagnetic tempests that scoured their world not as obstacles to be overcome, but as manifestations of a primal consciousness, the great storm that had in its infinite wisdom and chaotic fury scattered fragments of itself into mortal vessels. Their temple forges, carved deep into mountains, where the magnetic fields converged, were sites of both worship and creation, where the chosen performed intricate rituals of invention, crafting devices that resonated with the storm's frequencies. At the core of their theology lay the belief that consciousness itself was merely a pattern of energy, temporarily housed within fragile flesh, a pattern the storm had gifted to them, but that it would one day reclaim. The Telechines viewed their biological forms as crude, temporary vessels, necessary scaffolding that allowed the energy patterns of their true selves to interact with the physical realm before the inevitable dissolution of death released them to rejoin the divine tempest that had granted them life. This belief fostered both reverence and a strange sense of fatalism. They sought to honor the storm through technological creation, while accepting that it simultaneously yearned to reclaim the consciousness it had so generously bestowed. Their theology and way of life persisted for thousands of years as the world was destined to be shielded by a colossal warp storm, which only dissipated during the latter years of the 28th millennium. Suddenly exposed to the wider galaxy, it did not take long for the cultists of Mars to dispatch an exploratory fleet, which was to be greeted with a sight most alluring. The Martians, upon descending, found a society entirely devoted towards technological progress, with its peoples having crafted great machines which channeled and contained the roaring storms, reshaping this death world into one which could support life. The arrival of these red-robed priests bearing the iconography of the machine god was initially met with cautious reverence by the Telechines, who perceived in these visitors a kindred technological spirit. This reception swiftly soured when the Martians, led by the imperious Archmagos Dactyl, declared the natives' beliefs to be dangerous aberrations, their technologies borderline heretical. The First War was launched without warning, with the superior arms of the Skitarii being more than a match for the crude weaponry of the Telechines. But, most curiously, the natives, though branded as heretics, were all to be spared. The Magos was forced to admit that the Telechines had done something rather miraculous, in that they had conquered the hostile elements of their world, transforming the storm-ravaged landscapes into habitable stretches of land. But if they were to serve the machine god, they would need to put down their pagan beliefs. The rapid conquest was quickly followed by a period of cultural destruction, where the original Telechine way of life was systematically subsumed by the Martians. Their technologies, if deemed of as acceptable, were catalogued, purified, and redefined as gifts of the machine god, whereas those which were deviant were destroyed without mercy. It had hardly taken a week from the first appearance of the Mechanicum for the Telechines to fall from the rulers of this world into becoming just another cog within the relentless engine of Mars. It did not take long for the Telechines to fall into a position of servitude, but it was from their loyal service to the tech priests, which granted them with a rare form of grace. Their descendants were permitted to retain some semblance of their heritage by carrying the name Telechine, with the Archmagos believing that they would vanish into obscurity as yet another unimportant sub-faction of the Mechanicus. But if only he knew of how wrong he truly was. For thousands of years, Telchinea served as a prosperous forge world, supplying the surrounding sectors of Segmentum Pacificus with its great bounty of industrial output. Yet, down beneath the polluted clouds of toxic smog, not all was to be well upon the surface. What had once been a straightforward hierarchy of conqueror and conquered had evolved into something far more complex. The descendants of the victorious Martian delegation, now calling themselves as the Dactyls in honor of their founding Archmagos, had maintained their dominance, but beneath their rule, the social structure of the forge world had fractured like metal under thermal stress. The Telechines, though subjugated, were never fully extinguished. Their value as skilled artisans and their intimate knowledge of the planet's peculiar electromagnetic phenomena had made them too valuable to purge entirely. Instead, they were permitted to exist as a subordinate faction within the Mechanicus hierarchy, overtly adherent to an interpretation of the Martian doctrine, which had been adapted to include some of their primordial beliefs as to the nature of human consciousness. The Dactyl tech priests begrudgingly accepted that the electromagnetic storms could be seen as a manifestation of the motive force, but it greatly perturbed them to see the teachings of the cult Mechanicus being degraded in such a way. But as the centuries passed, and as successive generations of Forge Masters governed the world, it seemed as though the theological friction between the two groups had produced a landscape in which newer sub-factions could happily bloom. By the time Forge Master Rhodius ascended to leadership in the 40th millennium, 3 minor but increasingly influential subdivisions had established themselves alongside the dominant Dactyls and the subordinate Telechines. The Cabeirites had begun as a small sect of tech priests who maintained the ancient temple forges where the original Telechines had once worshipped. Prolonged exposure to these sites and the artifacts contained within had influenced their theology, leading them to revere what they called the old god of the forge, a primordial force they claimed predated even the Omnissiah, but which they insisted was merely an aspect of the machine god that the broader Mechanicus had forgotten. Their rituals involved elaborate electromagnetic ceremonies meant to commune with this entity, and their augmentations often incorporated unusual conductor materials that resonated with Telchinea's natural fields. The Orbanites, by contrast, had evolved from the world's resource allocation administrators. Over generations, their focus on efficiency and production had transformed into a belief that the accumulation of wealth represented the purest form of technological worship. They maintained that any gathered resources could be transformed into ever more complex machinery, and thus the hoarding of material wealth was equivalent to storing potential technological advancement, a form of worship through delayed creation. Their forged temples gleamed with precious metals, and they became rather iconic for their practice of augmenting their frames with gold and platinum components, harkening back to a period in human history where one's status was entirely derived from their wealth. Most concerning to the orthodox Dactyls were the Telocians, whose interpretation of the Omnissiah's teachings pushed at the boundaries of acceptable doctrine. The Telocians pursued what they termed complete mechanization, the total abandonment of their biology in favor of a purely cybernetic existence. While all tech priests sought to replace weak flesh with dependable steel, the Telocians' zeal exceeded even Martian standards. Their highest-ranking members retained only the barest minimum of organic material, perhaps only a fragment of brain tissue suspended in nutrient fluid, while the most radical elements whispered of technologies that might allow the complete transfer of consciousness to wholly mechanical bodies. Forge Master Rhodius surveyed this fractured landscape with increasing alarm. Though all factions claimed allegiance to Mars and the machine god, their divergent interpretations threatened both doctrinal purity and, more pressingly, industrial output. Reports of sabotage between factions had increased by 17% over the previous decade. Resource allocation disputes had risen by 23%. But most troubling, instances of unauthorized technological experimentation, particularly among the Telechines and Telocians, had increased by a full 35%. Skitari deployments into Cabeirite territory had progressed from simple patrols into enforced lockdowns as the priests were found to openly and outwardly worship their old god, chanting out his name in great rituals while leaving their own forges to languish in abandonment. The Orbanites, too, though quite orthodox in their faith, were slowly moving into more of an insular position, withdrawing from wider Mechanicus practices simply to bask in their immense stores of mineral wealth.
The trajectory is clear,
Rhodius declared to his council of tech priests, his voice modulated to a precise flatness.
Continued factional divergence will result in production inefficiencies of unacceptable magnitude within 7.4 years, and potential doctrinal schism within 12.3 years.
The traditional solution would have been a purge, the systematic elimination of problematic elements to restore orthodoxy. But Rhodius was a pragmatist above all else. The specialized knowledge each faction possessed was too valuable to sacrifice, particularly as demands from Mars for increased levels of production grew ever more insistent. The Imperium's endless wars required an endless supply of weapons and machinery, and Telchinea's output quotas had already been increased 3 times in the past decade.
We require unity without destruction,
Rhodius concluded.
Preserve the specialized knowledge, eliminate all divergent motivations, and realign all to the cult Mechanicus.
It was then that the Forge Master recalled from his databanks an entry on a tool which he had coined as the Unification Web. This strange machine, discovered by a fleet whilst exploring the lightless reaches of the Halo Zone, appeared to be an artifact from the dark age of technology, which would emit a psychic signal to dampen the minds of those within, uniting them all as loyal citizens to their guiding leader. In theory, it could be used to instantly bind the disparate factions into a single, coherent force without needing to rely on the inefficiency of a physical purge. Drawing from both Orthodox Mechanicus neural lacing technologies and from sanitized methods retrieved from the Telechine ways of electromagnetic manipulation, Rhodius designed a system most ingenious. The physical infrastructure of the web was constructed over the course of 7 years, its components manufactured in isolation by different factions, each unaware of the greater whole. Transmission nodes were embedded within every forge, temple, and habitation block. Receiver implants were introduced during routine maintenance of augmetics, presented as efficiency upgrades rather than control mechanisms. The central processing node was constructed deep within Rhodius's personal forge, a massive crystalline structure that hummed with barely contained power. On the day of activation, recorded in Telchinean records as the day of harmonious convergence, Rhodius gathered representatives from all factions within his cathedral forge. Before them stood the control interface for the web, a towering monolith of gleaming metal and pulsing light.
Today, we transcend our differences,
Rhodius announced, his mechadendrites extending toward the interface.
Today, we become one in purpose, one in devotion to the Omnissiah.
With a single command, the web activated. Across Telchinea, tech priests paused in their labors as a new presence brushed against their consciousness, not invasive but inviting, not controlling but connecting. The web did not override individual thought, but rather created resonances between minds, establishing harmonic patterns that gently guided disparate thoughts toward collective duty. To the priests, it felt as though a warm, comforting bubble had enveloped them, and though they couldn't quite pinpoint on what had changed, they simply couldn't ignore the welcoming sense of relaxation washing down through their mechanical limbs. The effect was immediate and profound. Production disputes that had persisted for centuries were resolved within hours, as the web facilitated understanding across factional lines. Theological disagreements did not entirely disappear, but were tempered by a sense of common purpose, the opposing viewpoints now revealed as different interpretations of the same divine principle, rather than being competing dogmas. Most importantly, the web allowed for the sharing of technological knowledge while filtering dangerous deviations. When a Telechine engineer conceived of a modification to a plasma reactor that drew upon the forbidden principles of the storm, the web subtly redirected those thoughts towards a more orthodox alternative that fell within the established order of the Mechanicus. When a Telosian priest developed a consciousness transfer protocol that veered too closely to the methods needed for birthing an abominable intelligence, The web gently obscured key components of the process, rendering it incomplete and thus harmless. Within a year of the web's activation, Telchinea's production had increased by 42%. Incidents of factional conflict had decreased to near zero. The Forge world had become a model of efficiency, its output so impressive that Mars itself sent observers to study what Rhodius had termed as the new paradigm of unified purpose. The factions continued to exist, with their distinctive practices greatly suppressed, but their differences were now complementary rather than divisive. When new technology was discovered from an exploratory expedition, representatives from each group would converge to determine who would be able to extract the most knowledge out of each artifact. And as it so happened, a new ship was just returning from warp travel, with a mysterious bounty locked in tow. The expedition fleet returned to Telchinea, bearing not triumph, but exhaustion. 3 of the original 5 vessels had been lost to the treacherous currents of the warp, and those that remained bore the scars of desperate battles against forces they refused to name. The fleet's explorator Magos, Ivantus Cord, had sealed himself in his quarters for the final weeks of the journey, emerging only when Telchinea's amber star appeared in the observation ports. Their destination had been Carthage Tharsis, a Forge world recorded as lost during the latter days of the Horus heresy. For millennia, warp storms had rendered the system inaccessible, but recent astrographic surveys indicated the turbulence had subsided enough to permit cautious exploration. The Mechanicus never abandoned its own, even those that had languished in obscurity for thousands of years, and the potential recovery of Dark Age technologies made the risk acceptable. What they found, however, was a forge that had gone entirely cold. Carthage Tharsis hung in the void, its once proud manufactura quiet, its atmosphere a toxic miasma of metallic particulates. The expedition found no survivors, only the silent remnants of what appeared to have been a catastrophic civil conflict. The damage pattern suggested the Forge world had turned upon itself, faction against faction, forge against forge, in a war which led only to the total extermination of all life. The fleet gathered what salvage they could: ancient technical schematics, rare material samples, and fragments of corroded machinery that might still yield usable components. Standard procedure dictated a thorough cleansing and cataloguing before any recovered items were integrated into Telchinea's repositories, but the fleet's tribulations had left little capacity for such precautions. When the salvage was laid out in Telchinea's primary receiving bay, representatives from all 5 factions gathered to witness the distribution. The Dactyls, as the dominant group, would have first claim, followed by the others according to their status and specializations. Among the recovered items was an object that initially attracted little attention: a truncated pyramidal device approximately 30 centimeters in height, composed of a dark metallic substance that absorbed light rather than reflected it. Its surface bore intricate etchings reminiscent of circuit patterns, and a faint electromagnetic field emanated from its core, detectable only to the most sensitive of instruments. As the cataloguing proceeded, a curious pattern emerged. The Telechine representatives, normally reserved in such gatherings, grew increasingly agitated. Their augmetic eyes remained fixed on the pyramid, their mechanical limbs twitching with barely contained excitement. When the time came for them to select their portion of the salvage, their chief representative rushed forward.
We claim the pyramid.
Declared Archmagos Theon of the Telechines.
Nothing more.
The declaration caused immediate confusion. The pyramid had been preliminarily classified as a decorative object of minimal technological significance. The Dactyls had calculated its value at less than 1,000th of the Telechines' fair allotment.
Clarify your selection parameters,
demanded the Dactyl overseer.
Your faction's entitlement exceeds this single object by a factor of 973.4.
We require only this.
Theon insisted, his voice modulated to a tone of religious reverence.
We relinquish all other claims.
Through the Unification Web, Forge Master Rhodius observed this exchange with growing unease. The web transmitted not only the words spoken, but impressions of the emotional states underlying them. And what Rhodius sensed from the Telechines defied categorization. Their desire for the pyramid radiated through the web with an intensity that the system struggled to process, creating subtle distortions in the otherwise smooth flow of shared consciousness. Nevertheless, there was no rational basis to deny the request. If the Telechines wished to claim less than their allotted share, then that was their prerogative. The remaining items would be redistributed among the other factions, increasing overall efficiency.
Request granted,
the Dactyl overseer announced, and the pyramid was formally transferred to Telechine custody. What happened next was subtle, so subtle that only Rhodius, connected to the minds of all his subjects through the web, could detect it. As Theon's mechadendrites made contact with the pyramid, a ripple passed through the Telechine contingent. For 2.7 seconds, they disappeared from the web entirely, as though their consciousness had been briefly extinguished. When they reconnected, something had changed. The harmonious resonance that had characterized their presence in the web had acquired a discordant undertone, barely perceptible but undeniably present. In the days that followed, the Telechines withdrew to their deep forges, taking the mysterious pyramid with them. Reports indicated that they had established unprecedented security protocols around the primary forge, where the pyramid was housed. Telechine participation in cross-factional projects decreased by 63%, with those who did participate exhibiting unusual behaviors, extended periods of silence, circular logical processes, and a marked decrease in emotional affect. Through the web, Rhodius attempted to discern the nature of their activities, but encountered an unexpected resistance. The Telechines remained connected to the web, but their thoughts had become opaque, as though they developed some form of mental shielding. When directly questioned, they offered plausible explanations about conducting sensitive research that required concentration. But the emotional resonance underlying these claims rang false. Most disturbing, however, were the dreams that began to plague Rhodius. As the architect of the Unification Web, his connection to it was deeper and more fundamental than of any other. When he entered his regeneration cycle, disconnecting his primary consciousness but maintaining base connectivity, fragments of Telechine thought patterns leaked through his defensive protocols. He experienced disjointed visions of swirling electromagnetic storms, of consciousness dispersed and reformed, and of ancient entities that existed beyond the material plane. But it was as though he was peering through ashen glass, and in truth he could hardly hazard a guess at the true intentions of the Telechines, or of the true nature of the curious pyramidal device. Deep within the electromagnetic nexus of their primary forge, the Telechines gathered around the treasured pyramid. The chamber had been sealed with unprecedented security protocols, including invasive neural scanners, purity field generators, and Skitarii sentinels ordered to repel any unauthorized presence. The great cohorts of this world were under the strict command of the Dactyls, so as to limit the power of the subordinate factions, and yet, with the presence of this mysterious artifact, a small grouping had now flocked to the Telechines, naming them as the true custodians to their home. Archmagos Theon placed the opaque pyramid upon a dais of polished obsidian, its surface inscribed with the ancient circuit runes of pre-Mechanicus Telchinea.
The storm.
He intoned, using a designation not uttered in millennia.
It speaks to us, after so long.
The highest-ranking Telechine priests formed a circle around the pyramid, their augmetic eyes cycling through spectrum analyses while data probes hovered tentatively near its surface. For 3 days they observed, measuring the subtle electromagnetic pulses that emanated from within.
Its patterns match the ancient records,
confirmed Magos Kyros, the faction's senior archivist.
The frequency oscillations are identical to those described in the forbidden texts.
What he was referring to was of an ancient collection of records preserved from the first colonists of this world, who had listened to the call of the Tempest and harnessed its power for their own good. The texts, etched upon crude slabs of steel, spoke of divine figures who named the very storms as their domain. It was said that in the absence of nature, that a device could be forged to extend their will across the cosmos, and that it would free the faithful, if ever subdued, beneath the chains of oppression. On the 4th day, they made their first tentative contact. A specialized mechadendrite, crafted from materials salvaged from pre-imperial technology and consecrated with oils whose composition had been passed down through generations, extended towards the pyramid's apex. The moment a connection was established, every augmetic system in the chamber faltered. Visual feeds dissolved into static. Internal chronometers skipped 17 seconds. Most significantly, each priest experienced a momentary disconnection from the Unification Web. A sensation many had never known, like suddenly regaining vision after a lifetime of blindness.
The web weakens in its presence,
whispered Theon, his voice modulator dropping to a register of religious awe.
just as the ancient texts prophesied.
In the days that followed, the Telechines conducted increasingly bold experiments. They discovered that the pyramid's influence could be directed and focused like a beam to create localized disruptions in the Unification Web. Further, they found that by exposing their own neural implants to its emanations, that they could grace themselves with moments of mental clarity, entirely liberated from the oppressive influence of the web. With each experiment, the pyramid's responses grew more pronounced. The electromagnetic pulses began forming patterns that, when decoded, revealed fragmented instructions, technical schematics for amplification devices, neural recalibration protocols, and modified incantations of activation.
It speaks,
declared Theon to his inner circle.
The storms will guide our hands once more.
Their breakthrough came when a junior tech priest, in what would have been condemned as reckless heresy weeks earlier, suggested connecting the pyramid directly to the Forge's primary power matrix. The proposal was not deliberated upon, but embraced with immediate fervor. The connection was made using adapted interfaces based on the pyramid's own geometries. As power surged into the artifact, it no longer merely disrupted the Unification Web. It actively repelled it. Throughout the Telechine enclave, minds that had known only filtered reality for decades, suddenly experienced raw, unmediated consciousness. The effect was catastrophic and revelatory at once. Many collapsed, overwhelmed by the sudden rush of unfiltered perception. Others experienced rapturous visions of swirling electromagnetic storms, but all shared a singular realization. The web had not merely been coordinating their thoughts, but actively suppressing aspects of their identity, memories of their heritage, and most importantly, their resentment towards Dactyl dominance. Their minds, once sealed, were now flooded with the sudden realization that their people had been forcibly enslaved by the oppressive Dactyls, who had been slowly, yet steadily exterminating their old culture, replacing it instead with the orthodox doctrines of Mars. As the Telechines adjusted to their newfound clarity, the pyramid's communications became more direct. Through patterns of light and electromagnetic modulation, it conveyed not just technical instructions, but a vision of a Telchinea freed from Dactyl oppression, where the ancient ways could be restored, where technology would serve consciousness rather than constrain it. Most crucially, it revealed the methods of its own replication. The pyramid was not unique, but one of many such devices created in a forgotten age. With the proper materials and rituals, more could be made, enough to free every mind on Telchinea from the web's influence. But to produce such artifacts, they would require elements which had been restricted by the Dactyls, and certain components would need to be sourced from the specialists of the wider factions. Thus, Theon, Archmagos of the Telechines, formulated a plan where emissaries would be dispatched to the Cabeirites, Telosians, and Orbanites, carrying with them fragments of the pyramid's influence in order to temporarily free their minds and sway them to their cause. The Cabeirites would be approached first. Their reverence for the old god of the forge shared obvious parallels with the storm's primordial consciousness. Then the Orbanites, whose materialistic ambitions could be inflamed by promises of wealth beyond Mechanicus restrictions. Last would be the Telosians, whose pursuit of mechanical transcendence could be redirected toward true liberation from biological constraints. As the emissaries departed on their clandestine missions, Theon returned to the inner sanctum. The pyramid's pulses had intensified, creating visible distortions in the surrounding air. Its communications had grown more frequent, more detailed, and more demanding. If he had retained more of his biological brain, Theon might have questioned why this artifact, recovered on a distant world, was so aligned with the old theology of Telchinea. He also might have wondered as to why it was pushing for an alliance with factions, whose own beliefs often contradicted with traditional Telechine doctrine. Maybe he would have questioned as to why the pyramid was insisting on the creation of such specific metallurgical formulations, which seemed unnecessarily complex for their stated purpose. But such doubts were beyond him now. Hearing the voice of the storms had awakened memories of oppression and promises of liberation. It had shown him a path to freedom from Dactyl dominance. What could it matter if that path required compromise, risk, or even the occasional contradiction? How could it matter even if the voice of the storm sometimes spoke in registers that caused pain rather than enlightenment? The first reports from his emissaries arrived via encrypted data bursts. The Cabeirite priests had responded with unexpected enthusiasm, recognizing in the storm's emanations the voice of their own suppressed deity. The Orbanites had proven more cautious, but ultimately receptive, particularly when shown projections of the material wealth that independence might bring. Only the Telocians remained ambivalent, torn between the promise of accelerated mechanical evolution and suspicion of anything that originated from the historically biologically adjacent Telechines. As Theon processed these reports, a tremor passed through the Unification Web, brief but distinct, like the first hairline fracture in the foundations of a great fortress. In his personal forge at the heart of Telchinea, Forge Master Rhodius jerked upright from his contemplation cycle, suddenly alert to a disturbance he could not yet name, but could certainly feel. The pyramid pulsed in response, as though acknowledging a distant challenger. Its next communication to Theon was not a technical schematic or strategic suggestion, but something more primal. A surge of electromagnetic energy that bypassed his cognitive processes and registered directly in the few remaining organic components of his brain as a single, overwhelming imperative. Accelerate. From the observation spire of his personal forge, Rhodius gazed upon the expanse of Telchinea. Plumes of sanctified smoke rose from 10,000 forges, illuminated by the amber glow of the system's star. Factory hives hummed with the resonant frequency of perfect efficiency. Cargo haulers traversed the arteries of the world, delivering resources and collecting the fruits of industry that would feed the Imperium's endless hunger. By every observable metric, Telchinea remained a triumph of order and productivity, yet something was wrong. With a series of precise mental commands, Rhodius disengaged his personal connection to the Unification Web. The process was uncomfortable, like voluntarily blinding oneself, but it was nonetheless necessary. In recent days, the web had become unreliable as an instrument of perception. The sudden isolation was jarring. For decades, his consciousness had been subtly intertwined with the collective mind of Telchinea. Now, alone in his thoughts for the first time in years, Rhodius confronted the disquiet that had been growing within him.
Discordance,
he murmured, the word emerging as both binary cant and spoken Gothic.
increasing in frequency and amplitude.
The Unification Web had begun registering anomalous patterns 87 days ago, coinciding with the Telechines' acquisition of the pyramid. Initially, these had been dismissed as routine fluctuations, as the web was a complex system, subject to occasional perturbations that self-corrected without intervention. But the new disruptions had not been fixed, and neither had they even been contained. They had grown, spreading outward from the Telechine enclaves like ripples in a contaminated pool. But it was the nature of the aberrations which had sparked such alarm. It did not cause simple disagreements or inefficiencies, but fundamental alterations in thought patterns, subtle enough to evade automated correction protocols, but profound enough to register in the web's deeper harmonics. Rhodius accessed his private data archive, reviewing production metrics from the past quarter. The numbers remained exemplary, exceeding quotas by an average of 17%. Yet when he cross-referenced these with the fluctuation patterns in the web, a disturbing correlation emerged. The areas showing the greatest productivity increases were precisely those experiencing the most significant thought pattern alterations. This was simply impossible. It was antithetical, paradoxical even, that derivation from the norm could in any way produce superior outcomes. His metal fingers tapped against the crystal viewport, producing a rhythm that matched no known binary sequence, an unconscious expression of the uncertainty plaguing his logic engines. Had he erred in creating the web? The question itself felt like tech heresy. The web had transformed Telchinea from a fractious, inefficient forge world into a model of Mechanicus industry. It had preserved the specialized knowledge of each faction while eliminating the conflict that had previously threatened production. It had been his masterwork, his gift to the Omnissiah. Yet now, in the silence of his disconnected mind, doubts surfaced like scrap code in a purified data stream. Perhaps the original Martian colonists had been correct in their brutal assessment, that divergent beliefs should be purged rather than accommodated. Perhaps Dactyl himself, the first Archmagos, should have eliminated the Telechines entirely, rather than permitting their survival as a subordinate faction. Perhaps each minor cult should have been excised at their inception, their cancerous presence removed, before they could establish themselves as an integral component of Telchinea's technological ecosystem. Had his creation of the web been not wisdom but hubris, an attempt to find a middle path where none could exist? The Adeptus Mechanicus did not typically tolerate such diversity of interpretation. Mars enforced doctrinal conformity with merciless efficiency. Rhodius's internal chronometer indicated he had been disconnected for 17 minutes, far longer than was prudent. His duties required the comprehensive awareness that only the web could provide, and these doubts, while logically structured, served no productive purpose. Thus, with a decisive mental command, he closed his augmetic eyes and re-established his connection to the Unification Web. The familiar presence flooded back into his consciousness, the collective thoughts of millions of tech priests, servitors and menials, all synchronized into a harmonious whole. The web embraced him, its algorithms detecting his disquiet and smoothly adjusting his neurochemical balance towards tranquility and certainty. Yes, there were anomalies. Yes, certain factions showed signs of deviation, but these were minor imperfections in an otherwise perfect system. The web's self-correcting mechanisms would identify the source of the discordance and eliminate it. If certain elements proved resistant to correction, they would be isolated and eventually purged. The doubt that had plagued him moments before seemed distant now, a brief malfunction resolved through proper reconnection to the greater whole. Production remained exemplary, Mars remained satisfied, and the Omnissiah's will was being fulfilled through the perfect operation of Telchinea Forge. All is as it should be. Rhodius thought, his mind pure and free from solitude once more. Behind him, unnoticed, a maintenance servitor's ocular implant flickered with an unusual pattern of light, a pattern identical to the pulses emanating from the Telechines pyramid. It observed the Forge Master for precisely 12 seconds before resuming its programmed duties, its memory banks transmitting a single compressed data burst to a receiver deep within the Telechine enclave. As night fell across Telchinea, the forges continued in their relentless production. But beneath the surface of apparent harmony, connections were being formed, alliances were being solidified, and plans were being finalized. The web that Rhodius had created to unify his world was becoming the very conduit through which division would spread. Division not random, but directed. Not chaotic, but purposeful. The final phase was fast approaching. The day of rebellion began like any other on Telchinea. Forges roared with productivity, data streams flowed through noospheric channels, and the Unification Web hummed with the synchronous thoughts of millions. Nothing in the morning devotional cycles indicated that by nightfall, the world would be irrevocably transformed. Rhodius was conducting the 37th ritual inspection of Fabrication Complex Delta 9 when his personal guard received an urgent data burst from the central monitoring station. Production in 3 major forge complexes had simultaneously ceased without explanation or warning. Before countermeasures could be initiated, 12 more reported total shutdown.
Implement emergency protocol Ferrum Secundus,
Rhodius commanded, his voice betraying no emotion despite the unprecedented nature of the disruption.
Dispatch security cohorts to all affected zones.
But the security cohorts never arrived. Throughout Telchinea, carefully positioned agents had disabled transportation networks, communications arrays, and defense systems. The disruptions had been calculated with mathematical precision to isolate the Forge Master from his loyalist forces. As Rhodius attempted to return to his central forge, his procession was halted by a massive explosion that collapsed the primary access bridge. Rerouting through secondary passages, his guards encountered increasingly desperate resistance. Skitari, once loyal to the Dactyls, opened fire without warning, their optical implants glowing with the same pulsating pattern that emanated from the Telechines pyramid. With a feeling that was all too human, Rhodius realized that the web had been compromised. He rapidly signaled the familiar mental command sequences to sever his connection, but they failed to execute. Something or someone was interfering with his mind, almost as if the web itself had been altered to trap those who sought to escape its influence. Through the corrupted web, Rhodius sensed the architects of his downfall. The Telechines had coordinated this insurrection with precision, but they were not alone. The Cabeirites had seized control of the planet's atmospheric processes, filling key Dactyl strongholds with a dense haze of incapacitating gases. The Orbanites had frozen resource allocation systems, stranding loyalist forces without ammunition or fuel. Most disturbing were the Telocians, who had unleashed experimental combat servitors to block access to the primary forge network, and whose new augmentations violated the most sacred tenets of Mechanicus doctrine. When Rhodius finally reached his inner sanctum, he found it already breached. Waiting for him was not a horde of attackers, but a single figure, Archmagos Theon of the Telechines, flanked by 2 guard servitors of an unusual configuration.
Your presence honors us, Forge Master,
Theon intoned, his voice modulated to project both respect and triumph.
You are privileged to witness the liberation of Telchinea.
This is tech heresy,
Rhodius declared, his weapon mechadendrites deploying automatically.
You will be transfigured into a servitor. Your people exterminated. You have tainted them all.
Theon made no move to defend himself.
Your weapons were recalibrated during your journey here. Their machine spirits now serve a different master.
Rhodius attempted to fire, but his mechadendrites remained immobile, frozen by commands he had not issued.
Your Unification Web really was a masterwork, Rhodius,
Theon continued, approaching the immobilized Forge Master.
It bound us together as you intended. But did you ever wonder as to what would happen if we broke free from its bond? of how it would unify us in our hatred for you and the Martian dogs.
From beneath his robes, Theon produced the original pyramidal artifact, pulsing with increasingly potent waves of malevolent energy.
You granted us this gift, and from its form, we built hundreds, all now distributed throughout Telchinea. Each creates a localized disruption in your web, but together, they will shatter its connection, finally freeing us from your tyranny.
With a horrifying clarity, Rhodius finally understood.
The web never malfunctioned. You corrupted it.
It is not corruption to break the chains of our enslavement,
Theon corrected.
We will have no need of the web once the night is over.
Before Rhodius could respond, one of Theon's guard servitors moved with unexpected speed, driving a specialized mechadendrite directly into the Forge Master's primary neural port, the sacred interface through which he connected most deeply with the web. Pain beyond calculation flooded Rhodius's systems as the servitor pumped corrupted scrap code directly into his core consciousness. Through the agony, he perceived the true extent of the conspiracy, not merely a coup against his authority, but a fundamental rewriting of Telchinea's relationship with technology, with the Mechanicus, and with reality itself. As his systems began to fail, a final command sequence executed automatically. It was an emergency call for aid to Mars, bearing news of tech heresy and rebellion. The transmission lasted precisely 3.7 seconds before Telchinea's orbital communication arrays were disabled by pre-placed explosives. Whether the message was received would not matter to Rhodius. His consciousness fragmented as the corrupted code overwhelmed his defenses, shattering the carefully structured pathways of his augmented mind. His final coherent thought was not of the Omnissiah or of Mars, but of his creation, and of the desperate yet foolish thought that in this final moment that the web would somehow reactivate and save him. But there could be no salvation, and as his lifeless body crumpled to the ground, it now seemed as though the time of the Dactyls had come to its end. With Rhodius's termination, the central node of the Unification Web lost its primary architect and administrator. For 7.4 seconds, the entire system fluctuated on the edge of collapse as automated protocols attempted to compensate for the sudden absence. But with a deliberate precision, Theon inserted the miniature pyramid into the central node. He believed that this would stabilize the web, so as to gently disconnect every individual from the network, saving them from the jarring sensation of having one's mind ripped from unity. However, the artifact, once positioned, quickly interfaced itself with the web's core architecture, its impossible geometries merging with Rhodius's creation to form something new. It still retained the capacity to unify minds, but it now seemed as though it was oriented towards a very different purpose. Throughout Telchinea, tech priests experienced a moment of disorienting freedom as the web's influence finally wavered. For many, it was the first time in decades they had experienced untethered consciousness, but nothing could have possibly prepared them for the empty void which would be left when unshackled from the greater collective. The rebellious factions which had orchestrated Rhodius's downfall expected a time of jubilant liberation, but what they experienced instead was chaos. The carefully coordinated alliance quickly dissolved into disorganized violence as the web's influence faded away, leaving naught but a power vacuum, which each faction rapidly moved to fill. Tech priests who had stood together moments before turned upon one another with a sudden inexplicable hatred. Forge complexes that had peacefully coexisted for centuries now prepared great artillery batteries, primed to fire on but a moment's notice. But even in the absence of the web, the remaining factions still found some sense of unity, thanks to the presence of the Dactyls. The four remaining factions, though ideologically opposed, could temporarily put aside their differences and halt their hostilities towards one another, in favor of seeking the total extermination of the priests who enforced their silent subjugation. Theon stood in Rhodius's sanctum, watching through data feeds as Telchinea descended into civil war. This had not been part of his calculation. The storms had promised liberation, unification under the ancient ways, not this mindless brutality. He thought that with the shattering of the web, that the Dactyls would have surrendered. But instead, they now seemed prepared to fight to the bitter end.
Why?
He transmitted directly to the pyramid, now pulsing with increased intensity.
This serves no logical purpose.
The response came not as data, but as a sensation, a feeling of ancient amusement, of plans within plans, of purposes beyond the comprehension of beings still partially bound to a physical form. As darkness fell across Telchinea, the world burned with the fires of fratricide. The unity that Rhodius had enforced through technological communion had been shattered, and though they had indeed been granted with freedom, from the ashes of control came more conflict than cooperation, and more hatred than of harmony. Even though the coup was now complete, the fall of Telchinea had only just begun. The war for Telchinea lasted 108 days. Not a single forge remained untouched by the devastation, as faction turned against faction in an orgy of violence that defied all logical purpose. The Dactyls, once masters of the forge world, found themselves besieged from all sides, their numbers dwindling with each desperate defense. From the highest spire of what had been Rhodius's forge cathedral, Magos Dominus Trisitus of the Dactyls observed the burning landscape.
"We cannot hold,"
he transmitted to his remaining commanders.
"Initiate protocol Ferrum Terminus."
This final protocol, which would trigger the self-destruction of all Dactyl forge complexes so as to deny their technology to the rebels, was never implemented. As Kaelus's finger hovered above the activation rune, the very air around him distorted. None could have possibly reacted in time, as an immense electromagnetic storm screamed through the towering spire, rendering the command staff down to ash and toppling the great edifice into a heap of charged scrap. Across the battlefield, the Telechines had fully embraced the ancient technologies awakened by the pyramid. They no longer merely studied the electromagnetic storms of Telchinea, and now they channeled them, becoming living conductors for energies that should not have been controllable by mortal science. Their tech priests strode across the field of battle, wreathed in crackling lightning, their augmetics glowing with unholy power as reality itself bent around them. The Cabeirites had abandoned all pretense of Mechanicus orthodoxy. Their priests tore off their sacred robes to reveal flesh inscribed with circuit patterns that pulsed with sickly light. They charged into battle, screaming the name of their deity, Cabeirus! Cabeirus! Each utterance was accompanied by impossible phenomena. Machinery animating without power sources, metal flowing like water, and dark shadows rising to life. The Telosians unleashed their most forbidden creations, legions of combat servitors whose augmentations violated every principle of the Mechanicus. These were not the controlled lobotomized thralls sanctioned by Mars, but nightmarish hybrids where the boundaries between flesh, machine, and something other had been deliberately blurred. Some moved with unsettling fluidity, others phased in and out of visible reality, but all killed with mechanical precision and unmistakable pleasure. Most pragmatic of all were the Orbanites, who seemed less interested in combat than acquisition. Their forces systematically stripped every battlefield of valuable components, retreating to their increasingly fortified forge temples with troves of precious metals, rare earth elements, and irreplaceable archaeotech. When forced to fight, they deployed weapons that transformed rather than destroyed, turning opponents into statues of precious metals that were then harvested and added to their growing hoard. By the 72nd day, the last organized Dactyl resistance had been eliminated. By the 90th, the various rebel factions, having destroyed their common enemy, turned upon each other with increasing savagery. By the 108th day, an uneasy equilibrium emerged. Not peace, but exhaustion, as each faction consolidated control over their territory and assessed their transformation. What followed then was not victory, but horror. The Telechines, abandoning official command structures in favor of divine guidance, conducted systematic purges of the forged cities under their control. Any who could not or would not embrace the storm were eliminated, their components harvested for the creation of new pyramid artifacts. The once sacred forges were reconsecrated to entities that existed within the electromagnetic tempests, entities whose names caused recording devices to malfunction when spoken aloud. To make matters worse, despite the apparent triumph of the rebels, a sense of disquiet had begun to spread among the Telechine leadership. The powers they had awakened proved difficult to control. Tech priests who had embraced the storm too eagerly began to exhibit disturbing symptoms: spontaneous molecular destabilization, unprovoked violence, and worst of all, the tendency to hear voices emanating from supposedly inanimate machinery.
This is not the liberation I foresaw,
Theon confided to his inner circle, studying a data feed of the original pyramid, which now pulsed with darker and more painful energies, almost as if it knew that it was being watched.
We were supposed to be free, but the storm speaks with so many voices now. Voices which I do not believe were always present.
During the days which followed from their uneasy ceasefire, the various factions were finally given the chance to fully embrace their own beliefs, but from their hubris came catastrophe. The Telosians pursued their obsession with mechanical transcendence to its ultimate conclusion. In a ceremony that lasted 9 days, their entire priesthood underwent what they had named as the rite of final separation, and it would involve the complete excision of all remaining biological components. What emerged from their surgical temples were no longer tech priests, but something entirely other, pure automata that moved with cold precision but exhibited behaviors indicative of individual consciousness. These new Telosian automata were marvels of engineering that should have been impossible, machines that thought, felt, and even reproduced without biological components. Their freedom from flesh should have represented the pinnacle of their philosophy, but instead, observers noted a strange uniformity overtaking them, their individual differences gradually fading as they responded to signals no scanning technology could detect. The Orbanites' fate was perhaps the most bizarre. Having accumulated wealth beyond calculation, they began an unprecedented project, the transmutation of their entire forged temple complex into solid gold. The process began at the outermost walls and progressed inward, transforming not just the structure, but everything within, including machinery, servitors, and eventually the Orbanites themselves. What they had intended as the ultimate display of wealth became their prison. The transmutation, once begun, could not be halted or controlled. Orbanite tech priests found themselves trapped as the golden wave swept through their sanctuary, desperately trying to escape, even as they were encased in the precious metal they had coveted. Their final transmissions spoke of revelation, that their obsession had been manipulated, their technology corrupted to serve a purpose they had never anticipated. The golden forged temple now stood as a grotesque monument, its inhabitants visibly preserved mid-motion within its walls, their expressions frozen in the moment they realized their true fate. Most triumphant of all were the Cabeirites, who believed that their faith had been vindicated. In the central chamber of what had once been the primary forge cathedral, they constructed an immense idol combining elements of machinery with anatomical features that no human or sanctioned abhuman had ever possessed. Before this monstrosity, they conducted rituals of technological communion that resulted in the creation of increasingly disturbing artifacts from their forges, devices that pulsed like hearts, weapons that screamed when activated, and implants that bestowed capabilities no Mechanicus tech priest had ever sanctioned. 144 days after the fall of Rhodius, the Cabeirites summoned representatives from the other factions to witness what they described as the final revelation. In the shadow of their grotesque idol, High Priest Menoetius of the Cabeirites addressed the gathered tech priests.
"We have worshipped in ignorance,"
he declared, his voice distorted by augmetics that appeared to be growing rather than installed.
"The God of the Forge has revealed his true nature. Our ancestors were honored by his name, but he is near, the Lord of the Unknown, Master of the Forge Eternal, and Grand Architect of unbound power."
The idol behind him shuddered, segments of its surface rearranging to form symbols that caused physical pain to observe.
"Our God serves within the cult of the Archifane, and he is Cabeirus, Dark Lord to the flames of ambition. He has been with us from the dawn of time. He guided our eyes to the storms, and our hands to the forge. All we have created has been in his name, and all we have destroyed has been by his design."
The name hung in the air like a physical presence. Among the Telechines, recognition dawned with horror. Their ancient beliefs had not been awakened. They had been perverted, twisted into conduits for an entity that had never been part of their original theology. The Cabeirites had been misled and cast astray, only to reappropriate the devotion of the storm, with a creature born from a dimension beyond our own. As this realization spread, the idol's transformation accelerated. No longer even pretending to be a machine, it pulsed with unholy life, reshaping itself into a form that could not exist in reality without violating fundamental physical laws. From its surface, thousands of mechadendrites extended, each ending in an interface port identical to those installed upon the frames of every tech priest present.
"Embrace the true unity,"
Menoetius intoned, as the tendrils reached for the gathered representatives. Some fled, some fought, some submitted willingly, but none escaped the forged cathedral unaltered. Though they did not yet know it, the priests were now to bear witness to the end of Telchinea's time as a forge world, and of its rebirth into a hell forge devoted to the dark powers of chaos. In these final hours, the planet had shifted, mutating from a once loyal, albeit rebellious, pimple of humanity into something else entirely, a cancerous growth within the body of the Imperium, a melting pot of heresies, where the distinctions between technology and sorcery had been deliberately erased. The Dark Mechanicus had risen from the ashes of factional warfare, not as a rebellion against the Omnissiah, but as a perversion of everything the machine god represented. But in the ruins of what had been the central conduit to the Unification Web, the original pyramid pulsed with satisfaction, its purpose nearly complete. Theon stood within the primary forge of the Telechines, the old architecture now twisted and perverted, every surface writhing with symbols that defied mortal interpretation. The revelation from the Cabeirites' ceremony had shattered what remained of his logical processes. The technological liberation he had championed, the ancient storm he believed he served, all of it had been a calculated deception.
We have been deceived,
he transmitted to his inner circle, those few Telechines who still maintain some semblance of independent thought.
The storm is not our salvation. It is a conduit for something else.
Data feeds from across Telchinea had confirmed his worst predictions. The Cabeirites had fully embraced their otherworldly patron, transforming their forges into blasphemous temples where machinery and flesh were fused in configurations that defied both physics and sanity. The Telosian automata, once the pinnacle of mechanical evolution, now moved in perfect synchronicity like extensions of a single mind, a mind that was neither machine nor human. The Orbanites remained entombed in their golden prison, their frozen faces visible through the translucent metal, as silent witnesses to their ambitious folly. Most tragically, Theon was also forced to receive transmissions from the rebellious Telechines, who had fallen to the emergent madness of the war. Rogue tech priests had amassed great cohorts to resume in their ruthless purges, decimating the planetary populace, who, in their own words, had been silently complicit in the Dactyls' age-long oppression.
We must destroy it,
Theon declared, indicating towards a broken replica of the pyramid,
before the corruption spreads further.
But even as the Telechines mobilized to contain the artifact, alarms sounded throughout their enclave. The great network of pyramids, which they themselves constructed, had changed in their frequency, pulsing out now at an accelerated rate, which caused physical pain to organic components and data corruption to augmetic systems. The very air around them shimmered with unnatural energies. Through every Vox channel, across every data stream, a single name reverberated: Cabeirus. Within the Cabeirites' transformed cathedral forge, the grotesque idol, built in the image of their ancient god, continued in its sickening process of change. Its mechanical components melted away, revealing something that had never been machine, but had merely worn technology like ill-fitting clothing. Limbs stretched to impossible proportions, surfaces rippled with symbols that burned themselves into the minds of observers, and at its center, a face emerged. A face with features that suggested both ancient wisdom and predatory hunger. With a deafening and otherworldly roar, the demonic lord took its first steps upon the world, finally graced with a physical body anchored to the unholy faith of its corrupted flock. Immediately, the creature rushed out, breaching the ruins of what had once been the personal quarters of Forge Master Rhodius. As within still lay the central node to the Unification Web. Ever since Theon first inserted the pyramidal artifact into the Great Node during his rebellious coup, it had remained almost entirely silent, only pulsing gently with warm, crimson light to illuminate the empty and desolate chamber. But now, with the demon towering above, it seemed as though its time for dormancy was long over. Servitors who had been maintaining the inactive systems found themselves possessed by new programming, their simple minds overwritten by complex protocols of uncertain origin. With mechanical precision, they began reconfiguring the central node, incorporating components salvaged from the Great War, which had ravaged every corner of Telchinea. What emerged was a nightmarish hybrid of Mechanicus technology and something far older, a network of crystalline structures that pulsed with the same malevolent energy as the original pyramid. Theon, and the few Telechines who he could still command, desperately fought to reach the central chamber, cutting through waves of possessed servitors and corrupted tech priests.
"The web must not be reactivated,"
he transmitted.
"That creature was not from our storms. We cannot allow its corruption. We cannot allow its presence."
But his desperate counterattack came too late. As his forces breached the final barrier to the chamber, the demon that had worn the aspect of the Cabeirites' god materialized within, not physically, but as a projection of pure malevolent will. Impossibly vast, it towered over the reconstructed web node, mechanical tendrils extending from its form to interface with the corrupted machinery.
There is beauty here that you will never comprehend,"
the demon declared, its voice resonating from machinery that should not have been capable of producing sound.
"A machine to unify minds, to align purposes, and you sought to break it. To free those born to be slaves? You will never know the transcendent power you could have reached."
With a gesture that violated the principles of physical reality, the demon activated the corrupted web. Throughout Telchinea, tech priests of all factions suddenly stiffened as the familiar sensation of the Unification Web flooded their consciousness. But it was twisted now, perverted into something that did not suggest unity, but demanded submission. Unlike Rhodius's original creation, which had gently guided thoughts towards harmony, this corrupted web seized control with brutal efficiency. It did not persuade, it dominated. It did not suggest, it rewrote. Memories were erased, loyalties reconfigured, and the very essence of individuality was systematically expunged. Theon felt it invading his systems, bypassing defenses that had once successfully resisted the original web's influence. He fought with every resource at his disposal, initiating emergency shutdown protocols, activating isolation subroutines, and even going so far as to take a sharpened blade to physically sever his neural interfaces. For 3.7 seconds, he maintained his autonomy, longer than of any other tech priest on Telchinea. In those final moments of independence, he experienced a clarity that had eluded him since the pyramid's discovery. The storm he had worshipped had never been divine, but merely a natural phenomenon. The ancient Telechine beliefs had contained no special wisdom, only the same superstitions that plagued all primitive cultures. The liberation he had fought for had been nothing but a path to a more complete enslavement. Then the corrupted web overwhelmed his final defenses, and Theon ceased to exist as an independent entity. His body remained, his knowledge was preserved, but the consciousness that had defined him was subsumed into the collective nightmare being forged in the demon's name. Across Telchinea, every tech priest experienced the same fate. The factional identities that had defined the Forge world for millennia were erased in an instant. Dactyls, Telechines, Cabeirites, Orbanites, Telosians. These designations became meaningless as all were reforged into a single entity, the Dark Mechanicus of Telchinea, servants of Cabeirus, new master to the reborn Forge. None were to be spared, not even of the Orbanites, entombed within their golden prison. Though physically immobile, their consciousness remained accessible to the web, their specialized knowledge of transmutation now redirected toward the creation of abominable alloys that could house demonic entities within seemingly innocent machinery. The transformation of Telchinea was complete within a single solar day. The forges, once dedicated to the production of sanctified technology for the Imperium's war machine, now churned out corrupted creations that defied categorization. Weapons were forged that fed on the souls of their users, vehicles trundled out that altered reality around them, and augmetics were prepared that granted forbidden capabilities at the cost of one's humanity. From orbit, the planet appeared unchanged. It had the same industrial sprawl, the same atmospheric pollution, and the same rhythmic activity of a productive Forge world. But beneath this superficial continuity, everything had changed. The tech priests moved with unnatural synchronicity, their actions guided not by individual will, but by the collective consciousness imposed by the corrupted web. When a routine Imperial trade vessel approached 3 months later, it was permitted to land without incident. Its crew was efficiently processed, not killed, but converted, their flesh and minds reconfigured to serve Cabeirus' design before being sent back into the Imperium as unwitting vectors of corruption. The message transmitted to Mars and Terra remained one of absolute normalcy. Production quotas were met with unprecedented efficiency. Required rituals were observed with perfect precision. Nothing in the official communications at all suggested the horror that Telchinea had become. In the corrupted ruins of what had once been Rhodius's inner sanctum, now transformed into a temple to technological perversion, the demon reflected on its triumph. The factional divisions that had defined Telchinea had served their purpose, creating the conditions for rebellion, for the shattering of orthodox control. But those divisions had been merely a means to an end, a tool to be discarded once its utility was exhausted. True power lay not in liberation, but in unification, and not the benign form of unity that Rhodius had envisioned, but the absolute subjugation that the dark gods required. The Forge world was now entirely united in purpose, its every action aligned with the demon's will, its every creation a step toward the corruption and destruction of the Imperium of man. If the tech priests of Telchinea could still think for themselves, they might have recognized the bitter irony of their fate, that their quest for freedom from the Unification Web had led them to a more complete and horrifying enslavement. They might have rebelled against the consciousness that now controlled their every thought and action, or might have sought to warn the Imperium of the cancer growing within its industrial heart. But their time for independent thought was long over. Their individuality had been scrubbed from existence more thoroughly than any Mechanicus mind-wipe protocol could achieve. Their knowledge remained, their skills were intact, but the consciousness that employed these resources was no longer their own. For Telchinea, the age of factions, of debate, and of competing interpretations had ended. Now, there was only unity in service to powers beyond comprehension. Now, there was only the endless production of technological horrors. Now, there was only chaos. Throughout the long and dark history of mankind, the fall of Telchinea stands not as a tragedy, but as a warning, etched in the fires of betrayal, on the inherent perils which lurk within mankind's embrace and reliance upon technology. Those who dismiss the Mechanicus as being superstitious or as overly cautious towards new discoveries would do well to contemplate on the fate of this world, for in its death cry lies a vindication of the Imperium's most foundational fears. Technology, in its essence, is neither benevolent nor malevolent. It is a conduit, a medium through which intent is amplified and realized. But this very quality renders it perpetually vulnerable to corruption. Like a precision instrument calibrated to detect the faintest signals, advanced technology becomes receptive to influences beyond the material plane, to whispers from the warp, to entities that perceive creation itself as an affront to their chaotic nature. A tool which one uses for good can equally be converted for evil, and at some point the lines will inevitably blur, leading to an innate impression and constant expectation of maliciousness. The Imperium's fear of technological progress, often derided by those who fail to comprehend the true dangers of the universe, is revealed through Telchinea's fall to be not paranoia, but profound wisdom. Mankind's history is littered with the wreckage of civilizations that embraced innovation without caution, that worshipped at the altar of progress without acknowledging the predators drawn to such devotion. The men of iron, the abominations of the old night, the techno-heretical atrocities of the Horus heresy, all stand as monuments to the fundamental truth that unconstrained technological advancement inevitably attracts the attention of forces beyond mortal comprehension. In the case of Telchinea, Forge Master Rhodius's greatest error was not in his creation of the Unification Web, but in his arrogance that this tool could resolve what was, at its core, an ideological conflict. The various factions of Telchinea represented not merely different approaches to technology, but fundamentally incompatible worldviews. The Dactyls' willingness to permit these divergent philosophies to exist, to fester beneath the surface of apparent unity, was not tolerance, but abdication, and not wisdom, but weakness. The Unification Web, rather than addressing the root causes of factional division, merely masked the symptoms. It created the illusion of harmony while allowing dangerous ideological deviations to persist, shielded from the scrutiny that might have identified and excised them before they could metastasize into full heresy. The web did not heal the divisions upon Telchinea. It merely postponed the inevitable confrontation while providing the perfect conduit through which corruption could eventually spread. Had the original Martian delegation, or even the Dactyls of later millennia, recognized the danger posed by divergent technological philosophies, they might have acted with the necessary ruthlessness to preserve the Forge world's spiritual purity. The extermination of the native Telechines, the suppression of the emerging Cabeirite cult, the purging of the materialistic Orbanites, the execution of the soulless Telosians, these acts, while brutal, might have preserved Telchinea for the Omnissiah's glory. Instead, misguided tolerance allowed the cancer of heresy to grow until it became inoperable, until the only possible outcome was the complete corruption of the Forge World's soul. The warning signs were present throughout Telchinea's history, in the Telechines' unorthodox relationship with electromagnetic phenomena, in the Cabeirites' worship of an old god of the forge, in the Orbanites' materialistic obsession, in the Telosians' pursuit of complete mechanization. Each represented a deviation from the machine god's truth, which, when left unchecked, eventually blossomed forth to produce a critical vulnerability, which the darker powers of the warp were able to exploit. When the pyramid artifact arrived on Telchinea, it found fertile ground already prepared for corruption. The factions, their divergent beliefs preserved beneath the web's influence, became perfect vectors for chaos. Each was corrupted not against their nature, but through it. The Telechines through their reverence for electromagnetic forces, the Cabeirites through their worship of an ancient deity, the Orbanites through their materialism, the Telosians through their desire for mechanical transcendence. Chaos did not need to break these factions, but merely to twist them, to guide their existing desires toward damnation. The ultimate irony of Telchinea's fall is that the second binding, the corruption of the Unification Web by the demon Cabeirus, succeeded precisely where Rhodius failed. It did not preserve factional differences, but erased them entirely, creating not harmony between divergent philosophies, but the absolute subjugation of all thought to a single malevolent will. The unity that Rhodius sought through gentle technological guidance was finally achieved through demonic domination. This, then, is the lesson that Telchinea's tragedy offers to the Imperium. Technology without orthodoxy is a beacon to the ruinous powers. Tolerance of deviation is not compassion, but complicity. Unity based on anything but absolute adherence to sanctified truth is merely delayed damnation. The Mechanicus' rituals and restrictions, its obsession with proper form and procedure, its resistance to innovation, these are not weaknesses, but essential safeguards against the very corruption that consumed Telchinea. For those who might still question the necessity of such caution, who might argue for more rapid technological advancement or greater tolerance of divergent interpretations, the fate of Telchinea stands as the ultimate rebuttal. A forge world that once shone with the light of industry and invention now burns with unholy fire. Manufactories that once produced the weapons and vehicles with which mankind defended itself against the darkness now churn out abominations that serve only to extend that darkness. Knowledge that was gathered over millennia in service to the Omnissiah now feeds the insatiable hunger of the ruinous powers. The machines it produces now bear the taint of chaos, carrying corruption into the wider Imperium with every deployment. The tech priests who once debated the fine points of Mechanicus doctrine now move with soulless precision, their individuality subsumed into a collective consciousness that serves only to extend the demon Cabeirus' influence. The storm that the ancient Telechines worshipped has been replaced by a tempest of a different nature. It is now a warp storm contained within the planet's very essence, feeding on the collective souls of those now caught within its hellish swell. Telchinea was lost, not through external conquest or resource depletion or natural disaster, but through the most preventable of causes: ideological deviation, technological hubris, and misguided tolerance. Its fall was not inevitable, but self-inflicted, a wound that festered into gangrene, because those with the power to amputate lacked the will to act. And this is the final legacy of the Forge. It is not merely a world which fell to chaos, but it will remain as a foul monument to the perils of technological innovation, divorced from spiritual purity and of unity, built upon compromise rather than conformity. It stands as a warning to all Forge worlds, and to all who would recklessly seek to advance technology without sufficient caution nor care. Let those with the wisdom to understand heed this final warning that the ruinous powers are ever watchful, ever hungry, and that technology without proper constraint will ever be their most faithful servant. But with this, my dearest friends, we have now come to our end. Thank you so much for listening to this extended story in its entirety, and I do hope that the irony of hearing this tale recited by a robotic voice is not lost. But for now, I must once again close this chapter. And as I go, know that I will wish each and every one of you with a very warm goodbye.